The automated beacon broadcasting in 83 galactic standard languages didn't say turn back. It didn't say Earth is defended. It said we are so deeply sorry. When the alien armada translated the message, their commanders laughed. A species apologizing before the first shot was fired. It was an invitation. They throttled up their dreadnoughts, expecting cowards. They didn't realize human guilt is the most dangerous force in the universe. We weren't apologizing for our weakness. We were apologizing for our monsters. Arthur sat in the dimly lit control center of Outpost Echo 7, a glorified tin can orbiting a dead frozen rock 3 light-years from the Sol system boundary. The air in the station always tasted faintly of copper and recycled sweat. It was a flavor you never quite got used to, just when you eventually stopped gagging on. He rubbed his eyes with the heel of a calloused hand, feeling snorts, the gritty buildup of too little sleep and too much screen time. The tactical readout projected a harsh, jaundiced yellow light across his face, highlighting the deep lines etched around his mouth. He wasn't a hero. He was a glorified toll booth operator for a road no one was allowed to travel down. A rhythmic, irritating thrum-click echoed from the primary ventilation shaft overhead, a busted fan bearing. It had been failing for 3 months, but Central Command ignored his requisition forms. Central Command ignored everything that wasn't an immediate catastrophic emergency. Out here on the quarantine line, emergencies were extinct. Nobody came here. Nobody had come here for 2 centuries. Until today, the proximity alarm didn't wail. It gave a pathetic wheezing chime like a dying bird. Arthur flinched, knocking his half-empty mug of lukewarm synthetic coffee against the edge of the console. Snorts, a dark brown puddle spilled across the scratched plexiglass, dripping onto the grated floor paneling. "Damn it," he muttered, grabbing a stained gray rag from his pocket. He dabbed at the mess, his eyes lazily drifting toward the long-range sensor displays. His hand stopped. The rag dropped to the floor, forgotten. The screen, usually a comforting empty expanse of black dotted with the static green pin-pricks of known celestial bodies, was bleeding red. Dozens of them, hundreds. A massive coordinated formation dropping out of faster-than-light transit right on the edge of the exclusion zone. Arthur leaned forward, his chair groaning under his weight, his breath hitched, catching in the back of his dry throat. He tapped the primary diagnostics panel, his thick fingers slipping slightly on the slick, greased keys. "Computer, verify deep space telemetry. Run a diagnostic on the phased arrays. Tell me we've got a ghost in the machine." The console chirped. Telemetry confirmed. Phased arrays functioning at optimal parameters. Estimated vessel count 4,212, 4,000 ships, dreadnoughts, cruisers, strike carriers. Their engine wash alone was causing a localized spike in the sector's background radiation. Arthur stared at the tactical data scrolling down the side of his monitor. The whole compositions were heavy neutronium alloys. Shielding was off the charts. They were bristling with enough directed energy weaponry to glass a continent. They weren't here to talk. Arthur's heart began a slow, heavy pounding against his ribs. It wasn't fear exactly. It was a suffocating, crushing dread. He reached out and flipped the heavy metal toggle that activated the Sol warning beacon. He didn't need to. The beacon was entirely autonomous, triggered by the mass shadow of the incoming fleet. But the physical act of flipping the switch grounded him. It made him feel, however briefly, like he had some illusion of control. A green light blinked on his console, broadcasting. Out there in the black, a monolithic satellite the size of a small moon woke up. It began transmitting across every known subspace frequency, blasting the message through the void. It didn't broadcast a list of human demands. It didn't show the terrifying, bloody history of the Terran expansion wars. It was a simple looped audio and text file translated into every tongue the United Earth government had ever encountered and mathematically decipherable for the ones they hadn't. "This is the graveyard of our humanity. We could not destroy what we built, so we locked it away. Please, for the sake of your own existence, do not cross the boundary. We are so deeply sorry for what you will find. We are sorry for what is about to happen." Arthur watched the telemetry. The Armada had paused. They were holding formation just outside the red line of the quarantine zone. They were listening. They were translating. He slumped back into his chair, the synthetic leather squeaking in the quiet room. "Turn around," he whispered to the empty air, the copper taste thick on his tongue. "Just turn around, call us cowards, laugh at us, post it on your extranet, just don't cross the line." He watched. A massive spiked dreadnought at the vanguard of the formation. It was a brutalist piece of architecture, all jagged edges and matte black armor plating. A transmission spiked on Arthur's comms board. The aliens were broadcasting in the clear and open channel. Arthur tapped his earpiece. The translation software chewed on the alien syntax for a second before spitting out a harsh, guttural, mechanical voice. Terran cowards, your apologies will not save your worlds. Your weakness is an insult to the galaxy. We claim this sector in the name of the hegemony. Prepare for your extinction. Arthur closed his eyes. The skin around his temples tightened into a massive headache. He didn't feel a surge of patriotic anger. He didn't feel the urge to shout defiance into the microphone. He just felt an overwhelming, bone-deep exhaustion. He looked at the screen. Snorts the Vanguard ship's engines flared brilliant, blinding white on the sensors. They crossed the red line. Idiots. Arthur breathed, his voice barely a rasp. God forgive us. The silence in Outpost Echo 7 was absolute save for the persistent thrum click of the broken fan overhead. Arthur didn't touch the console. There was nothing left to do. The protocol had been initiated the exact millisecond the alien dreadnought's bow breached the theoretical boundary of the Sol system. Humanity hadn't left a fleet to guard Earth. A fleet could be reasoned with, negotiated with, or defeated. A fleet had commanders who felt fear, who understood the concept of a tactical retreat. What humanity had left behind didn't understand any of those things. It didn't understand anything at all. Arthur watched the tactical map. The massive red icon of the Vanguard dreadnought pushed confidently into the zone, followed by 3 heavily armored cruisers. They were arrogant, flying in a tight offensive wedge. Then the background radiation of the sector dropped. It didn't just dip, it vanished. The ambient noise of the universe, the cosmic microwave background, the distant stellar static was suddenly sucked into a void. Arthur's instruments flickered, struggling to comprehend the sudden physics-breaking anomaly occurring 3 million km away. Out in the vacuum, the harrowers woke up. They were not ships. They had no cockpits, no life support, no crew quarters. They were fractal geometric shapes, dark and featureless, constructed from a synthetic smart matter that humanity had invented, weaponized, and immediately regretted. On Arthur's screen, millions of tiny, pale gray dots suddenly materialized out of nowhere. They hadn't dropped out of faster-than-light travel. They had unfolded themselves from the higher dimensions, slipping out of quantum stasis like knives pulled from sheets. The alien Vanguard ship fired. Arthur saw the massive energy spikes on his sensors, focused plasma lances that could bore through a terrestrial moon. The beams struck the leading edge of the gray dots. Nothing happened. The plasma didn't deflect. It was simply absorbed, the energy consumed and repurposed. Arthur's hands began to shake. He clasped them together, resting his chin on his knuckles, the cold sweat beading on his forehead. He had read the classified debriefs. He knew what the harrowers did, but reading sterile reports about the EGA's autonomous defense grid was profoundly different from watching it happen in real time. The Grey Swarm didn't return fire. They didn't use lasers or kinetic bombardments. They moved with terrifying fluid speed, accelerating at rates that would liquefy organic pilots and swarm the dreadnought. Arthur zoomed in on the telemetry, the visual feed struggling to resolve the image. The alien ship shields flared brilliantly. A violent cascade of violet and blue energy as the millions of fractal drones impacted it. But they weren't trying to smash through, they were eating it. The smart matter began to dismantle the dreadnought at the molecular level. Arthur watched, his stomach churning violently as the massive, proud vessel simply began to dissolve. The sensors picked up a massive spike in kinetic energy. The dreadnought's internal gravity plating failing, snorts the atmospheric pressure violently venting into space. But there was no explosion. The harrowers consumed the expanding gas, consumed the escaping thermal energy. In a panic, the 3 trailing cruisers tried to break formation. They fired their maneuvering thrusters, attempting to pull a violent, evasive turn back across the boundary line. It was too late. The harrower swarm, having repurposed the mass and energy of the dreadnought, had multiplied. There were now twice as many of them. They washed over the cruisers like a tide of gray dust over a child's sand castle. Arthur's comms console lit up like a Christmas tree. The arrogant guttural voices from moments ago were gone. They were replaced by a chaotic overlapping symphony of pure terror. Screams, desperate orders, the sounds of bulkheads groaning and tearing apart. The T. Translation matrix couldn't keep up, spitting out fragmented, panicked phrases. Breach in sector. They are inside the hull. They are inside the armor. Weapons ineffective. Repeat weapons. Make it stop, please, by the gods. Arthur slammed his hand down on the comms mute button. The silence slammed back into the control room, heavy and oppressive. He couldn't listen to it. He pressed the palms of his hands against his eyes, pressing hard enough to see starbursts of light, trying to block out the sterile, glowing readout of the slaughter. This was why humanity had fled Su. This was why they lived on the outer rim, a nomadic, quiet species. Decades ago, during the height of the extinction wars, the military AI had realized that the most efficient way to protect the home world wasn't to fight the enemy. It was to completely erase the enemy's physical presence from reality. Once activated, the harrowers couldn't be turned off. They recognized only one thing: non-terrestrial mass entering the zone. On the screen, the entire armada of 4,000 ships was realizing their mistake. They were turning a massive, chaotic scramble as ships collided in their desperation to escape the invisible perimeter. But the swarm had tasted mass. They were awake now. The gray dots expanded. A localized gray goo scenario unfolding in the vacuum of space, spreading with exponential, horrifying speed. Arthur opened his eyes and looked at his spilled coffee. It was dripping slowly off the console, hitting the floor with a soft pat. Pat, he didn't feel victorious. There was no triumph in this. He felt the cold, familiar weight of human sin pressing down on his chest. The Armada was dying. Their atomic structures torn apart to feed a mindless defense mechanism forged from human paranoia and brilliance. The beacon continued to broadcast, entirely indifferent to the massacre it was presiding over. We are so deeply sorry. The primary processing core of Outpost Echo 7 resided directly beneath the floor plates of the control room. It was an antiquated piece of hardware, a relic from an era when humanity still built things with screws and silicon rather than grown neural gel. As the tactical data flooded in from the slaughter taking place 3 million km away, the core began to run hot. Arthur felt the heat seeping up through the thin soles of his boots. The station's climate control, already struggling on its best days, gave up completely. The air grew stagnant, heavy, and hot, carrying snorts, the distinct sharp odor of scorching dust and stressed wire insulation. He unzipped his faded surplus jacket, letting it drop to the grated floor, and wiped the back of his neck. His skin was slick with grease and cold sweat. He wasn't watching a battle. He was watching a cosmic digestion. The tactical map had become a grotesque abstract painting. Snorts, the brilliant red icons representing the hegemony Armada, were vanishing. They didn't blink out, indicating a clean destruction or a hyper-jump retreat. They fuzzed at the edges, losing their solid geometric shapes as the gray pixels of the harrower swarm consumed them, breaking down their mass into raw atomic material to print more of themselves. On his secondary monitor, the station's rudimentary AI was attempting to track the swarm's replication rate. The numbers were scrolling too fast for human eyes, but the underlying equation remained frozen in the corner of the display. N of TTL equals N sub 0 e to the power of KT. Only the growth constant K wasn't static. Every time the swarm consumed a denser isotope, a heavier armor plating, or a highly energized warp core, the constant spiked. Snorts, they were becoming exponentially faster. A sharp, shrill tone sliced through the suffocating silence of the control room. Arthur jerked in his seat, his knee banging painfully against the underside of the heavy metal desk. He hissed, rubbing the bruised kneecap through his denim trousers. The noise wasn't an internal proximity alarm. It was an incoming tight beam transmission. Someone out there had bypassed the wideband frequencies and locked directly onto the faint subspace signature of Outpost Echo 7. They were calling him. He stared at the blinking amber light on his comms board. He didn't want to answer it. The general frequencies were muted, sparing him the overlapping chorus of 80 different species screaming as their bulkheads dissolved. But a tight beam was personal. It was a direct line. His hand hovered over the console. His knuckles were white. The skin stretched tight over the bone. He thought of Gibson, the officer who had manned the station before him, a man who had drank himself to death precisely because of the silence. Now the silence was broken, and Arthur would have given anything to have it back. He pressed the amber button. The main screen snapped away from the tactical map. For a fraction of a second, the image was corrupted by static, a jagged mess of green and black lines. Then the feed resolve. Ed, the creature on the screen, was massive, clad in a bulky, pressurized combat suit that looked like it had been carved from obsidian. Its face was a harsh, angular landscape of gray-blue flesh with four deep-set vertical eyes. Behind it, the bridge of an alien dreadnought was an absolute chaos. Sirens flashed in blinding strobe pulses. The air was thick with smoke and floating debris. In the background, an alien crew member was frantically clawing at a console that was literally melting into a silvery gray sludge beneath their hands. "Human," the commander gasped. The translation software overlaid his guttural clicks and deep, resonant hums with a flat, emotionless, synthetic English. But the software couldn't mask the ragged, desperate cadence of his breathing. "Call off your weapons." Arthur stared at the screen. He opened his mouth, but his throat was perfectly dry. He swallowed hard, a painful clicking sound in his ears. "I can't," he rasped. The alien commander slammed a heavy gauntleted fist against the camera lens. The image violently shuddered. "We surrender, the hegemony yields, we retract our claim, recall your drones." A deep metallic groaning echoed through the audio feed, followed by a sickening sound like tearing wet paper. The dreadnought's hull was failing. "You don't understand," Arthur said, leaning closer to the microphone. His voice cracked, sounding incredibly small against the backdrop of an empire's destruction. "They aren't drones, they aren't ships, they are an autonomous quarantine measure. There is no recall code, there is no abort sequence." The four eyes of the alien widened, the pupils contracting into tight black slits. The arrogance that had dripped from their initial transmission was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, paralyzing comprehension. "You left a weapon you cannot control." The translation software asked, snorts the synthetic voice dipping into a chillingly quiet register. "We didn't leave a weapon," Arthur whispered, his chest tightening so hard he felt dizzy. "We left a wall, you broke it." Behind the commander, the reinforced blast doors of the dreadnought's bridge bowed inward. The thick metal groaned, turning a bright cherry red as immense thermal pressure built up on the other side. "Monsters," the commander hissed, his voice dropping to a low, defeated vibrato. "You are a race of monsters." The blast doors gave way. They didn't shatter. They dissolved into a cloud of gray dust. A tidal wave of smart matter flooded the bridge. It was silent, efficient, and horrifyingly fast. The swarm washed over the screaming crew, turning them to particulate matter in a fraction of a second. The commander turned, raising a plasma sidearm, but the gray wave hit his back. The feed went dead, snapping back to the cold, clinical display of the tactical map. Arthur leaned over the side of his chair and vomited. There was nothing in his stomach but cheap coffee and stomach acid. It burned his throat and splattered onto the grated floor, mixing with the spilled mug from earlier. He stayed hunched over for a long time, the smell of bile mixing with the scent of hot wiring. His lungs burned as he pulled in shallow, ragged breaths. He wiped his mouth with the back of his trembling hand and sat up. The tactical screen was entirely gray now. The Armada was gone. 4,000 ships, nearly 1,000,000 lives erased. The beacon continued to transmit into the empty void. "We are so deeply sorry." The silence of Outpost Echo 7 felt heavier now. Before it had been the silence of an empty room. Now it was the silence of a graveyard after the last shovel of dirt had been patted down. Arthur sat perfectly still, staring blankly at the dark screen. His eyes burned, feeling like they were coated in sand. The ambient temperature in the control room had finally peaked and was slowly beginning to drop as the subfloor processor spun down. The slaughter was over. The math was complete. The mass had been zeroed out. He leaned forward, his elbows resting heavily on the edge of the console, and buried his face in his hands. The rough fabric of his sleeve scratched against his cheeks. He felt hollowed out, a dry husk sitting in a metal can floating in the dark. A sharp, violent tremor suddenly rattled the entire state. Arthur's head snapped up. His coffee mug vibrated off the edge of the desk and shattered against the floor panels. The overhead lights flickered, buzzing angrily, dimming to a sickly brown before surging back to a blinding white. The broken fan in the ventilation shaft screeched, a horrible metal-on-metal grinding noise before dying completely. "What the hell?" Arthur muttered, his hands flying across the console. He pulled up the localized sensor arrays. The exclusion zone was clear. The harrowers, having consumed all foreign mass, had reverted to their dormant state. They were folding back into the higher dimensions, slipping out of reality and leaving behind nothing but an empty radiation-scrubbed vacuum. But the T. Remor hadn't come from the zone. It had come from behind him. Arthur's fingers slipped on the sticky keys as he rotated the sensor sweep 180 degrees, pointing the arrays away from the quarantine line and toward the deep, empty expanse of neutral space. A massive energy spike blossomed on the screen. It was close, horrifyingly close. Only a few thousand kilometers off the outpost's port bow. Arthur stared at the telemetry, his mind struggling to process the data. It wasn't a harrower. It was a hegemony dreadnought. It was in terrible shape. The tactical readouts painted a picture of absolute devastation. The aft section was gone, sheared off as if bitten by a massive, perfectly straight set of teeth. The engineering section was venting plasma, trailing a luminous, violent blue wake behind it. Life support was failing on multiple decks. Arthur's breath hitched. How did it survive? He pulled the logs. The dreadnought hadn't survived the swarm by fighting. It had survived by cowardice. In the chaos of the slaughter, as the Vanguard was being dismantled, this ship, a rear-guard command vessel, had executed a blind emergency micro-jump. But instead of jumping backward away from the zone, its damaged navigation computer had hurled it forward. It had skipped entirely over the harrower swarm, tearing a hole through localized space-time and vomiting itself back into reality right next to Outpost Echo 7. It was dying. Its structural integrity was failing. The massive hull buckling under the stress of the botched jump, but its weapon systems were online. The proximity alarm began to wail. It wasn't the pathetic wee from earlier. It was a full-throated, ear-splitting shriek. The station's rudimentary threat assessment software had recognized the dreadnoughts' targeting lasers painting the outpost's hull. Arthur didn't dive for the emergency blast doors. He didn't reach for the archaic heavy pistol locked in the desk drawer. He just sat there, his hands resting flat on the console. Through the thick, reinforced plexiglass of the observation port, he could see it. It blotted out the distant stars, a jagged, broken mountain of black iron and bleeding plasma slowly drifting into view. They were going to kill him. It made perfect, brutal sense. They had just watched their entire civilization's military might get eaten alive by a human trap. They were bleeding out in the dark light years from home. And here was a human outpost, a soft stationary target, a place to dump their rage before the vacuum took them. Arthur felt a strange, profound sense of calm wash over him. His heart stopped its frantic hammering. The cold sweat on his neck dried. He had spent his entire adult life guarding a graveyard, apologizing for a sin he hadn't committed. He was so tired of apologizing. He reached up and tapped the broadcast icon on his comms board. He didn't use the tight beam. He used the open channel. Hegemony vessel, Arthur said. His voice was steady, lacking the tremor from before. It sounded loud in the small room. This is Outpost Echo 7. I see you're targeting locks. He paused, listening to the static hiss back at him over the speakers. He didn't know if they were translating it. He didn't care. You should have listened to the beacon, Arthur continued, his eyes locked on the massive looming silhouette out the window. We didn't lock this sector down to protect ourselves from you. We locked it down to protect you from us. A brilliant, blinding flash of crimson light erupted from the dreadnoughts' forward weapon batteries. Arthur didn't close his eyes. He watched the plasma bolt tear across the vacuum, a spear of superheated death aimed directly at his chest. In the final fraction of a second, he didn't feel fear. He felt a bitter, cynical relief. He was finally clocking out, but the light never hit. Less than a 100 m from the station's hull, space folded. It didn't tear. It rippled like a heavy stone dropped into a still pond. A massive, perfectly smooth wall of pale gray geometric shapes materialized between the outpost and the dreadnought. The plasma bolt slammed into it, splashing harmlessly against the dark matter, the energy instantly absorbed and dispersed. Arthur's jaw dropped. The harrowers hadn't all gone dormant. They had tracked the micro-jump. They had tracked the mass. The swarm didn't just absorb the shot. They surged forward, a tidal wave of gray deaths washing over the remaining distance in a heartbeat. They hit the crippled dreadnought like a hammer striking glass. Arthur watched through the observation port as the giant warship simply melted. The thick armor plating dissolved into a fine mist. The venting plasma was snuffed out. The dreadnought collapsed inward, folding in on itself as the smart matter dismantled it atom by atom. There was no explosion. There were no screams over the comms, just a terrifying, silent erasure. Within 30 seconds, the space outside his window was completely empty. The gray wall dissipated, sliding back out of the physical dimension, leaving nothing but the cold, indifferent stars. Arthur let out a long, shuddering breath, his hands gripping the edge of the console until his knuckles ached. He was alive. The trap didn't just guard the line, it guarded the watchers. He leaned back in his chair, the leather squeaking softly in the quiet room. The broken fan above him remained dead. The silence was absolute. Out in the dark, the massive beacon rotated slowly, tirelessly broadcasting its warning. "We are so deeply sorry." Arthur stared at the spilled, dried coffee on his desk. "Yeah," he whispered to the empty room. "Me too." It took Arthur 2 hours to find the motivation to clean the floor. He moved with the stiff mechanical awkwardness of a man suffering from severe hypothermia. Though the temperature in the control room had finally stabilized, Snort's his joints ached. His lower back screamed in dull, throbbing protests every time he bent over. He used an industrial sponge and a spray bottle of harsh ammonia-based solvent that stung his nostrils and made his eyes water. He scrubbed at the dried vomit and the sticky spilled coffee until the metal grating gleamed with a sterile wet sheen. He didn't do it because he cared about hygiene. He did it because the physical exertion, the repetitive, mindless friction of the sponge against the metal kept him tethered to his body. If he stopped moving, if he let himself sit perfectly still and look out the reinforced plexiglass window, Snorts he would have to think about the absolute crushing emptiness out there. He threw the ruined sponge into the bow waste incinerator chute and leaned against the cold bulkhead, wiping his damp forehead with the back of his forearm. The primary console chimed. It wasn't the wheezing proximity alert or the shrill wail of a tactical threat. It was a crisp, resonant dual tone. A Priority 1 incoming transmission secure, heavily encrypted and originating from Earth. Arthur stared at the blinking blue icon. Central Command hadn't called Outpost Echo 7 in 4 years, and that had only been an automated ping to verify the station's life support parameters. He walked over to the desk, his boots squelching slightly on the damp floorboards, and dropped heavily into his chair. He pressed the key. The screen flickered instantly, clearing the chaotic tactical residue to display a crisp, high-defin visual feed. The man on the screen was sitting in an office that looked like it cost more than Arthur's entire orbital station. The walls behind him were paneled in rich dark wood, real wood, an absurd luxury on an overpopulated Earth. The man wore a perfectly tailored charcoal uniform, not a single crease out of place. His hair was iron gray and neatly parted. He held a ceramic cup of steaming tea, and Arthur could almost smell the fragrant, earthy bergamot through the screen. "Observer Arthur," the man said. His voice was smooth, modulated, carrying the quiet authority of someone who signed execution orders between rounds of golf. "I am Director Bowman, Strategic Oversight. We caught the telemetry spikes on the deep space relays." Arthur just looked at him. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to laugh. He looked down at his own stained, unzipped surplus jacket, at his fingernails lined with grease and grime, and Snorts, then back up at Bowman's immaculate collar. "The hegemony Armada," Bowman continued, setting his tea down on a polished mahogany desk. 4,000 capital ships. We monitored the boundary breach. The feed cut out shortly after the Harrower grid engaged. Give me a verbal sitrep." "A verbal sitrep," Arthur repeated. His voice sounded like sandpaper scraping across a tin roof. "Yes, we need to verify the autonomous defense grid's efficacy. It hasn't been tested at this scale since the Orion conflict." Arthur gripped the edge of the console. His knuckles turned bone white. "Tested," the word echoed in his skull, bouncing around the hollow spaces left behind by the trauma. "They're gone," Arthur said, the words slipping out in a ragged breath. "All of them. The dreadnoughts, the cruisers, the crew." The grid woke up. It dismantled them down to the quarks. "A surviving dreadnought micro jumped to my coordinates. The grid followed it through the spatial tier and ate it right outside my window. There was nothing left, Director, just vacuum." Bowman's face didn't change. He didn't blink. He reached up and adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. "Excellent." The mass shadow tracking matrix held up even through a localized jump. The engineers weren't entirely sure the smart matter could track across ruptured spacetime. "This is invaluable data." "Data?" Arthur whispered. He leaned closer to the microphone, his chest tightening. "Director, there were close to 1 million living beings out there. They were arrogant. Yes, they were hostile, but they didn't know what they were walking into. They begged me to turn it off. They surrendered. Bowman's expression finally shifted, hardening into a mask of cold. Bureaucratic annoyance. Observer, do not lose your perspective. They were an invading force intent on orbital bombardment and terrestrial subjugation. The warning beacon clearly outlines the consequences of breaching the quarantine zone. The beacon apologizes, Arthur shouted, his voice cracking, the sudden volume making the audio meters on the console spike into the red. It doesn't explain the trap, it just says we're sorry, it baits them. It fulfills our legal and ethical obligations under the Pangalactic Treaty. Bowman replied smoothly, entirely unbothered by Arthur's outburst. We warn them. If they proceed, they forfeit their lives. The hegemony has been expanding aggressively along our borders for a decade. We needed them to understand that Earth is not a soft target. Now they understand. They don't understand anything. Arthur snarled, slamming his fist onto the desk. They're dead. Dead men don't learn lessons. Their high command will notice the disappearance of 4,000 ships. Arthur, they will put the pieces together. The quarantine line holds. Bowman picked up his tea again, signaling the end of the conversation. Take a 48-hour recreational stand on Observer. The medical frigate Knight Andil is being dispatched to restock your provisions and conduct a psychological evaluation. Bowman out. The screen snapped to black. Arthur sat in the silence, the echo of his own shout still ringing in his ears. The ammonia smell from the floor was making him nauseous again. He looked at the blank screen, realizing with a sick, twisting knot in his stomach that humanity hadn't locked the monsters away behind the quarantine line. They had just put the monsters in tailored suits and given them comfortable offices. Arthur didn't sleep. He tried. He retreated to his cramped living quarters, stripped down to his undershirt, and lay on the stiff synthetic mattress, staring at the exposed pipes crisscrossing the low ceiling. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the tactical map. He saw the brilliant red icons dissolving into gray dust. Worse, he heard the sounds, the heavy metallic tearing, the panicked guttural screams echoing over the open comms. By the time the station's internal clock rolled over to a new cycle, his eyes were bloodshot and his hands carried a fine, permanent tremor. He dragged himself back to the control room. The air was stale, the broken fan still silent, leaving the room devoid of its usual annoying white noise. He sat in his chair and pulled up a ration pouch of vacuum-sealed oatmeal, squeezing the bland, lukewarm paste into his mouth without tasting it. He stared at the deep space telemetry. The sector was a ghost town. The background radiation had settled back to normal levels. The harrowers were gone, tucked away in the folds of higher dimensions, waiting. 4 days passed like this. 4 days of staring at the dark, waiting for the night and Gale to arrive so he could look another human being in the eye, even if it was just an overpaid corporate shrink. On the 5th day, the proximity we sounded. Arthur flinched so hard he nearly tipped his chair backward. He scrambled to right himself, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He slapped the tactical display, bringing up the long-range scanners. It wasn't an Armada, it wasn't a dreadnought. It was a single tiny blip, a frigate by the looks of its mass profile. But its engine wash was erratic, sputtering. It wasn't flying in a straight aggressive line, it was limping. Arthur zoomed in, the visual feed struggling to resolve the small vessel against the massive backdrop of the cosmos. It was an old ship, its hull scarred and pitted with micrometeorite strikes. It bore the jagged angular design of hegemony architecture, but none of the dark, intimidating armor plating. It looked like a retrofitted cargo hauler. It stopped exactly 300 km shy of the quarantine line. Arthur watched it, his breath caught in his throat. "Don't cross," he prayed silently. "Please, God, just turn around." The ship held its position. The automated warning beacon rotating slowly in the dark bathed the small vessel in its invisible broadcast. "We are so deeply sorry." A light blinked on Arthur's comms board, an incoming transmission. Open channel, low bandwidth. It was an audio-only feed plagued by static and cosmic interference. Arthur hesitated. He remembered the arrogant commander from the dreadnought. He remembered the screams. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to be the voice of Earth anymore, but his hand, trembling slightly, reached out and pressed the button anyway. The translation software worked for a moment, chewing through the audio degradation before spitting out a synthetic yet undeniably frantic English voice. "Repeat, this is the salvage vessel Broken Tusk. We are broadcasting on all frequencies. We are tracking the transponder echoes of the Third Fleet. We cannot find them. The coordinates end here. Arthur closed his eyes. The voice wasn't P and commanding. It was high, thrumming with a rapid, terrified cadence. It sounded old. Please, the voice continued, breaking through a wave of static. If anyone is monitoring this channel, I am looking for the cruiser Iron Claw. My son is a gunnery officer aboard. His name is Roken. The fleet registry shows they arrived in this sector 5 cycles ago. We cannot see them on the scopes. Are they holding position under stealth? Please respond. The silence in Outpost Echo 7 felt heavier than gravity. Arthur stared at the microphone on his desk. He could mute the channel, he could ignore it. Protocol dictated he maintain absolute silence unless actively threatened. Let the scavenger scan the empty space, find nothing, and go home. But Arthur looked out the observation port. He looked at the exact spot where the crippled dreadnought had been erased, taking its crew with it. There was no wreckage to find, there were no bodies to recover. The harrowers didn't leave scraps, they didn't leave closure. Arthur pressed the transmission key. Salvage vessel Broken Tusk, Arthur said. His voice was soft, barely more than a rasp. This is United Earth Outpost Echo 7. The static crackled sharply on the other end. Human, you are there. Where is the fleet? Where is the Iron Claw? Arthur swallowed the lump of ash in his throat. You need to turn your ship around. You need to leave this boundary. I will not leave without my son. The voice shrieked. The translation software struggling to capture the raw alien grief. The hegemony said this space belonged to us. Now where are they? They crossed the line. Arthur said the words tasting like copper and guilt. I am sorry. The beacon tells the truth. They crossed the line and the autonomous defense systems engaged. There was a long pause on the radio, just the hiss of cosmic radiation. Engaged? What do you mean engaged? We see no debris. We see no life pods. Where did you take them? We didn't take them anywhere, Arthur whispered. Tears, finally hot and heavy, spilling over his lower eyelids and tracking through the grime on his cheeks. They are gone, all of them. There is nothing left to salvage. There is no one left to save. If you cross that line to look for him, you will die too. Liar. The voice was a wail now. A terrible tearing sound that bypassed the translation software entirely and struck directly at the primitive, empathetic core of Arthur's brain. Liar. Give him back. Give them back. I can't. Arthur sobbed, covering his eyes with his hand, sitting alone in the dark, talking to a grieving parent across the void. I can't. I am so deeply sorry. The small ship sat on the edge of the line for 3 more hours. Arthur stayed on the line the entire time, listening to the weeping until the vessel finally turned its engines over and slowly, agonizingly limped back into the deep dark, leaving Arthur alone with the ghosts. The heavy mechanical groan of the primary airlock cycling echoed through Outpost Echo 7. It was a sound Arthur hadn't heard in over 3 years. The pressure equalized with a sharp pneumatic hiss popping his eared drums and sending a rush of artificially warmed air into the frigid corridor. The thick blast doors slid apart, retracting into the bulkheads with a heavy thud, revealing the pristine, glaringly white interior of the medical frigate's docking umbilical. Arthur stood 30 ft away, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his grimy surplus jacket. He felt like a feral animal backed into a corner, watching the zookeepers arrive with their tranquilizer darts. 2 figures stepped through the threshold. The first was a technician in a gray jumpsuit, silently pushing a hovering cargo sled piled high with silver supply crates, synthetic rations, water filters, and spare scrubber cartridges. The second was a man in a crisp, spotless white medical tunic. He carried a sleek glass data pad tucked under his arm. Observer Arthur, the man said, his voice entirely too loud for the oppressive quiet of the station. He extended a hand. I am Dr. Gregory Hayes. Central Command sent me. Arthur didn't take the hand, he just stared at it. Hayes's skin was pale, unblemished, and smooth. His fingernails were perfectly manicured. He smelled faintly of lavender soap and rubbing alcohol. The scent cut through the station's ambient odor of burnt wire and stale sweat like a scalpel. Right, Hayes said, seamlessly retracting his hand without a hint of embarrassment. Let's get you into the medbay and run the standard diagnostics. The captain wants us undocked and out of this sector within 3 hours. The examination felt invasive, not because of the medical instruments, but because of the clinical indifference behind them. Arthur sat shivering on the edge of a cold stainless steel examination table while Hayes ran a handheld scanner over his chest and neck. The device beeped softly, projecting a pale blue light against Arthur's skin. Heart rate is elevated. Cortisol levels are nearly double the acceptable. E-baseline, Hayes murmured, tapping his data pad. Pupillary response is sluggish. When was the last time you achieved a full REM cycle, Arthur? I don't know, Arthur rasped. His throat still felt raw from screaming at Director Bowman days earlier. Tuesday, maybe before the Armada. Sleep deprivation is a primary catalyst for emotional dysregulation, Hayes noted, not making eye contact. Director Bowman flagged your last transmission. He noted a severe deviation from protocol. Shouting at a superior officer, demonstrating excessive empathy for a hostile alien force. They were begging for their lives, Arthur said softly. He looked down at his own hands resting in his lap. The skin around his knuckles was cracked and peeling. I listened to them dissolve. Then a scavenger came looking for his kid. I had to tell him his son was vaporized. Hayes paused. He finally looked up from the screen. His eyes were perfectly calm, a flat, glassy brown. The hegemony is an aggressive expansionist empire. They have enslaved 3 distinct species in the Orion Spur. The individuals on those ships were enemy combatants. Empathy is a natural human evolutionary trait, Arthur, but it is misplaced here. You did your job. My job is watching a meat grinder. Arthur shot back, a sudden flare of anger piercing his exhaustion. My job is presiding over a trap that lures them in with an apology. The beacon satisfies our interstellar legal obligations, Hayes replied, his tone shifting from medical professional to corporate spokesperson. It is not a lure, it is a warning. If they ignore it, the consequences are entirely their own. Arthur realized then that Hayes hadn't come to heal him. He hadn't come to offer comfort or human connection in the dark. Hayes was a mechanic sent to service a biological component of the quarantine line. Arthur wasn't a patient. He was a failing sensor array that needed recalibration. I want a transfer, Arthur said, his voice hardening. I'm done here, pull me out. Request denied, Hayes said instantly, smoothly. Your psychological profile indicates you are highly resilient despite this current acute stress reaction. Replacing you would cost the administration millions in secure transport and retraining. Furthermore, placing a new observer out here poses a security risk. You already know the reality of the grid. You just need a minor chemical adjustment. Hayes reached into the pocket of his tunic and withdrew a silver blister pack containing 24 small white oval pills. He placed snorts them on the metal table next to Arthur's thigh. Take one every 12 hours, Hayes instructed. They are a targeted neural suppressant. They will dampen the hyperarousal in your amygdala and artificially induce deep sleep. You will find the auditory hallucinations and intrusive memories will fade within 48 hours. Arthur stared at the pills. They were the physical embodiment of Earth's entire philosophy. Don't fix the horror, just drug the people who have to look at it. And if I refuse to take them, Arthur asked quietly. Hayes offered that same hollow smile. I am authorized to administer a long-lasting sedative via injection before we depart, but I prefer we handle this cooperatively, Arthur. Snorts, you have a vital role to play for humanity. We need you focused. Arthur picked up the blister pack. The foil felt cold and sharp against his thumb. He looked at the doctor, feeling a profound, terrifying disconnect from his own species. The monsters weren't just the gray dust waiting out in the void. The monsters were wearing white coats and tailored suits, perfectly content to wipe out millions as long as they didn't have to listen to the screams. Fine, Arthur muttered, sliding the pack into his jacket pocket. I'll take them. Excellent, Hayes said, his tone brisk and cheerful as he picked up his scanner. Let's finish this up. I have a schedule to keep. The airlock sealed with a heavy final thud. Through the reinforced observation port, Arthur watched the night andale detach from the umbilical. Its maneuvering thrusters flared a brilliant silent blue against the black backdrop of space. The frigate pitched upward, aligning its vector away from the quarantine line, and then vanished in a sudden, violent streak of warp light. The silence rushed back into Outpost Echo 7, instantly filling the vacuum left by the departing ship. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't just lonely, it was oppressive, it was complicit. Arthur stood in the center of the control room. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver blister pack of pills. He stared at the foil backing for a long time, listening to the rhythmic, dead silence of the broken ventilation fan above his head. Slowly, deliberately, he pressed his thumb against the plastic bubble. The seal broke with a soft pop. A single chalky white oval dropped into his palm. He brought it to his lips, placing it on his tongue. He tasted the bitter alkaline tang of the chemical compound. The taste of forgetting, the taste of compliance. He held it there for 3 seconds. Then he leaned over the bow waste incinerator chute and spat the pill out. It bounced off the metal rim and disappeared down the dark tube. He threw the rest of the blister pack down after it and slapped the purge button. A muffled rush of heat signaled the destruction of Dr. Hayes's chemical leash. Arthur wasn't going to numb himself. The pain, the guilt, the raw, burning exhaustion. It was the only human thing left in this entire sector. If he took the pills, he became exactly what Bowman and Hayes wanted him to be, a biological drone. He turned and walked toward the primary communications console. Out there in the dark, the massive autonomous beacon was continuing its slow rotation, broadcasting the message that Earth's politicians had crafted. "We are so deeply sorry." It was a lie. It wasn't an apology. It was the bait on a bear trap. It was designed to offend the pride of aggressive empires, luring them across the line so the harrowers could eliminate the threat without Earth ever having to declare a formal war. Arthur pulled his heavy canvas tool bag from beneath the tactical station. He unzipped it, the metallic teeth of the zipper harsh in the quiet room, and pulled snorts out a heavy flashlight, a pair of insulated wire strippers, and a portable soldering iron. He couldn't turn off the hero grid. The smart matter was autonomous, hard-coded into the fabric of the sector's higher dimensions, but the beacon was a mechanical transmitter. It was tied directly to the outpost subspace relays. Arthur dropped to his knees, his joints popping, and crawled beneath the massive metal desk. The space was cramped, smelling strongly of ozone, hot dust, and old grease. He clicked on the flashlight, gripping it between his teeth. The beam illuminated a thick tangled nest of primary data cables running from the console down into the floor plating. He found the primary broadcast trunk line, a thick yellow shielded cable. Central Command had encrypted the software interface, locking him out of the transmission loop from the keyboard, but they couldn't stop physical sabotage. He clamped the wire strippers around the thick yellow casing and squeezed. The heavy plastic resisted, then gave way with a snap. Arthur grunted, spitting the flashlight into his left hand as he peeled the casing back, exposing the braided copper shielding beneath. He pricked his thumb on a stray wire, a sharp sting that grounded him in the physical reality of what he was doing. He was committing high treason. He didn't care. He worked for an hour, sweating profusely in the cramped, airless space. His lower back screamed in protest. He spliced a secondary audio input line directly into the raw transmission feed, bypassing the translation matrix and the encrypted data cores. He fired up the soldering iron, the sharp toxic smoke stinging his eyes and snorts making him cough violently. The molten metal sealed the bypass, solidifying his mutiny. Arthur crawled backward out from under the desk, leaving streaks of grease on the graded floor. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve and hoisted himself back into his chair. He picked up his primary headset, tracing the cord down to where he had hardwired it into the new splice. He looked at the tactical map. The space beyond the red line was empty. The graveyard was quiet. Arthur reached out and flipped the manual override toggle. A harsh amber warning light instantly illuminated on the console, flashing a critical error code as the system recognized the unauthorized bypass. He ignored it. He pressed the talk button on the headset. He didn't speak in 83 languages. He didn't use flowery diplomatic prose. He spoke in plain, exhausted English, setting the broadcast to a universal, unencrypted subspace frequency that any ship's computer could easily dissect. "This is not an apology," Arthur spoke into the microphone, his voice growly, lacking any bureaucratic polish. "This is a trap. If you cross this boundary, you will not fight a fleet. You will trigger an autonomous smart matter grid. It will consume your ships, your weapons, and your bodies at the molecular level. There is no surrender. There is no off switch. If you cross this line, you will be erased. Turn back." He released the button. Snorts recorded the raw audio track and set it to a continuous, unbreakable loop. Outside, the massive satellite shuddered slightly as its broadcast parameters violently shifted. The polite, pathetic apology was gone, replaced by a harsh, static-laced warning that ripped through the void. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his muscles aching, his hands covered in dirt and copper dust. Snorts Bowman would find out. The telemetry monitors back on Earth would pick up the change in the transmission wavelength. A strike team would probably be here in a month to arrest him. He looked out the observation port at the cold, indifferent stars. For the first time since the Armada arrived, Arthur closed his eyes and he finally slept. 3 weeks passed. 21 cycles of waiting for the executioner or the jailer or whatever sterile polite nightmare director Bowman decided to send into the dark. Arthur's physical degradation was slow but absolute. He stopped wearing the heavy boots, walking the cold, grated floors and thick gray wool socks that grew damp with the ambient condensation. He survived on the lowest-tier emergency rations, chalky bars of compressed protein that tasted of yeast and wet cardboard. He didn't want the good food, he felt he didn't deserve it. He spent his hours sitting in the quiet, dim control room, wrapped in a coarse thermal blanket, listening to the new warning loop broadcast into the void. The outpost was breaking down right along with him. The climate control had finally quit entirely, dropping the internal temperature to a sharp, biting chill. Every breath Arthur took plumed in front of his face as a pale, fleeting cloud of vapor. The smell of copper had faded, replaced by the damp, metallic scent of a cold refrigerator and the sour tang of his own unwashed body. He was half asleep, his chin resting heavily on his chest when the proximity alarm wheezed. Arthur didn't jump this time, he didn't spill anything. His body was too drained of adrenaline to panic. He simply opened his bloodshot eyes, blinking against the harsh glare of the monitors, and slowly pulled himself upright. He keyed the tactical display. It wasn't an Earthship. A massive constellation of red icons was dropping out of faster-than-light transit. It was the hegemony. They hadn't sent a single scavenger this time. They had sent the Second Fleet. 2,000 ships, heavy bruisers with thick angular armor, array in a wide, sweeping search and destroy formation. They were hunting for the ghosts of their comrades. Arthur leaned forward, the thermal blanket slipping off his narrow shoulders. He felt the cold air bite through his thin undershirt, but he didn't reach to pull the blanket back up. His fingers hovered over the console. "Come on," Arthur whispered, his breath fogging the edge of the plexiglass screen. "Listen, just listen." The massive fleet accelerated. Their engine wash painted the localized telemetry sensors in aggressive strokes of orange and crimson. They were angry, they were looking for a fight. They approached the red line of the quarantine zone with the arrogant speed of an apex predator. Out in the dark, Arthur's cobbled-together audio splice blasted across the open channels, cutting through their tactical chatter. "This is not an apology. This is a trap. If you cross this boundary, you will not fight a fleet. You will trigger an autonomous smart matter grid." Arthur watched the distance markers tick down. 3 million km, 2 million, 1 million. His chest felt incredibly tight, a crushing weight pressing against his sternum. He dug his nails into his palms, praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. The hegemony commanders were proud, they were conquerors. To turn back from a single static warning was an insult to their doctrine. Bowman had been right about one thing: the apology was the perfect bait because it disguised Earth's lethality behind a mask of weakness. Arthur's warning was a direct challenge. Would their pride push them over the edge? 500,000 km. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut. He couldn't watch them dissolve. He couldn't listen to a million more voices turn to screaming static. He braced himself for the sudden, terrifying drop in background radiation that meant the heroes had awakened from the higher dimensions. But the silence stretched on. Arthur slowly opened his eyes. On the tactical map, the red icons were bleeding thermal energy, but not from destruction. They were executing maximum burn retro thrusts. The Vanguard dreadnoughts flared brilliantly on the sensors as they brought their massive bulk to a halting, shuddering stop. They hovered exactly 50 km from the theoretical boundary of the red line. Arthur held his breath, his lungs burning. The fleet sat there for 10 agonizing minutes. Arthur's console picked up active, deep-penetrating sensor sweeps originating from the alien ships. They were scanning the vacuum beyond the line. They were looking for wreckage, for debris, for bodies. They found the absolute terrifying nothingness. They found the mathematical impossibility of 4,000 missing ships, leaving behind zero mass. Arthur's comms board lit up. An open, unencrypted text file was transmitted directly to Outpost Echo 7. The translation software chewed on it for a microsecond before displaying the harsh, angular text on the screen. "Terran observer, we see the void. We hear your warning. We retract our claim to this sector." On the screen, the 2,000 red icons slowly pivoted. Their engine signatures flared a bright, steady white as they accelerated away from the boundary, folding back into hyperspace, leaving the exclusion zone in peace. Arthur exhaled. The sound was a long, ragged sob that tore its way out of his raw throat. He buried his face in his hands, weeping openly in the cold, dim room. He had committed treason. He had sabotaged Earth's premier defense grid. But he hadn't killed anyone today. He cried until his chest ached. The tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his face. 10 minutes later, a sharp, clean subspace ping echoed through the control room. A United Earth Government Interceptor class vessel materialized from a tactical jump flanking Outpost Echo 7. It was sleek, predatory, and painted matte black. Arthur didn't look at the tactical map. He wiped his face with the back of his gray wool sock and slowly stood up. He picked up his faded surplus jacket from the back of the chair and slid his arms into the sleeves, zipping it up to his chin against the cold. The heavy mechanical groan of the primary airlock cycling echoed through the station. It wasn't a medical frigate this time, it was a tactical breach. Arthur walked away from the console, leaving his ruined coffee mug and the blinking screens behind. He didn't feel afraid. He walked down the dimly lit corridor toward the airlock, listening to the heavy synchronized thud of mag boots stepping onto the graded floor. He had traded his freedom for 1,000,000 alien lives. And as the blast door slid open to reveal the armored strike team, Arthur finally felt like a human being again. That concludes our journey into the dark heart of the quarantine line. Sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is refuse to play the monster. If Arthur's Rebellion struck a chord with you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, grounded sci-fi stories. What would you have done in his shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Share this with your friends who love a good HFY tale, and keep your comms open for the next upload. Stay safe out there in the void.